All right, good afternoon and welcome to this COMPAS webinar on markets and innovation. I'm Eric McGilvery. I'm a professor in the political science department here at Ohio State, and I'm the coordinator of this year's COMPAS series on markets and the open society. As many of you know, COMPAS is a program at the Ohio State Center for Ethics and Human Values. COMPAS is an acronym that stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And the mission of the COMPAS program is to promote informed and civil discussion of important and controversial public issues. This event was originally conceived as the second panel of an in-person conference on the topic, Are Markets Progressive? But the fates decided otherwise, and in the name of public health, we've broken the conference into two webinars, of which is again the second. Before we get started, let me tease our next event. On Friday, March 4th, 3 weeks from today, we're hosting a mini conference on the value of open society, featuring a number of distinguished OSU colleagues and guests. COVID willing, it will be held in person on the 11th floor of Thompson Library, and will also be live streaming. More details about that conference and the whole Markets COMPAS series are available at cehv.osu.edu/compass. Today's webinar on markets and innovation will be moderated by my colleague, Emma Saunders-Hastings. I'll let Emma introduce our panelists, but first let me briefly introduce her. Emma is Assistant Professor of Political Science and a member of the Steering Committee for the Center of Ethics and Human Values here at Ohio State. Her research focuses on political, economic, and social inequality, with particular emphasis on private power, philanthropy, and paternalism. She's published in many leading journals, and her book, Private Virtues, Public Vices, which touches on all of those themes I just mentioned, is coming out this spring from the University of Chicago Press. Take it away, Emma.
Thank you, Eric. So welcome to today's panel. I want to draw your attention right away to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, where you can pose questions to our panelists at any point during the session today, and I will feed them to them during the Q&A. So we're going to start with some remarks from each of our panelists, then move to a general discussion. So we have two panelists today. Ryan Muldoon is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Buffalo. His primary research investigates how we can turn the challenge of increasing diversity into a resource to be tapped for mutual benefit. So he investigates how diversity can lead to more just societies, to an increase in the amount and quality of scientific production, and to greater wealth. He's the author of Social Contract Theory for a Diverse World Beyond Tolerance, and was also a core author of the 2015 World Development Report at the World Bank. Our second panelist is Julie Rose. She's an associate professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. Her research and teaching focuses on contemporary political philosophy with a focus on questions of economic justice. Her research addresses the ethical dimensions of our collective economic choices with a focus on distributive and social justice, justice in work, environmental ethics, and gender and family justice. She's the author of Free Time, a book arguing that citizens are entitled as a matter of justice to fair shares of free time. And she's currently writing a new book on justice and economic growth, provisionally titled The Ends of Growth. So we'll have our panelists speak in the program order. And again, feel free to pose your questions as we go. So that means we're beginning with Ryan.
All right, thanks very much. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm just going to run through a few slides to, I think, help situate what I think is a useful way of thinking about markets as innovative and quasi-progressive tools. So I think the useful way to think about markets is thinking them as other piece of other liberal institutions, which means that they're working to solve certain kinds of problems. We have some fairly core social political problems that pop up in different areas of our life. We're all differently situated from each other. We have different skills, we have different wants, beliefs, and values. And the sorts of problems or social challenges that we encounter are things that are kind of bigger problems than can be kind of resolved in a single person's head. And so what markets do and other liberal institutions do is we take lots of bits of information and choices and convert them somehow into larger scale social choices. So the market, and hopefully other liberal institutions as well, can be much smarter than any individual or entity in it. But with markets, as other liberal institutions, that's not particularly magic. That's just lots of smaller experiments or smaller decisions adding up through some procedural mechanism. So what I think is really useful about markets is that compared to some other liberal institutions, they more naturally harness the 3 Ds that I most enjoy: dynamism, diversity, and discovery. So I think one way of thinking about this is brought out by 2 papers by Hayek. So one really nice one is competition as a discovery procedure. Another is the use of knowledge in society. So the first big point that I think is really important is that market competition aids us in the discovery process. So any firm's desire for profit encourages local creativity and exploration of not only like an existing product space, but kind of nearby possibilities that no one's explored yet. And then more from use of knowledge in society, what the price system does isn't just working out a calculation problem for any given allocation and distribution decision. It instead also helps us uncover new uses for stuff, whether or not that stuff's been previously monetized or whatever. And it also figures out how to stop using stuff. So markets are really effective at figuring out more efficient ways of using things in existing or novel circumstances. And so what markets help us do is that they kind of help foster diversity and dynamism in a certain kind of sense, right? They allow for lots of differentiation. And they encourage responses to responses of our economic behavior. So a thing that's often an underappreciated feature of markets that is sometimes different from when we're thinking about kind of making joint or collective decisions where we're all agreeing or coming to some kind of a consensus about something, is that markets can reward you for being weird and different. Whether that's being weird and different in the sense of having strange ideas or valuing things on the market differently, or having private information or whatever it might be, the market can make room for you and kind of draw you into the broader scheme. And that's quite useful when in some other contexts, when we disagree about values or we disagree about ends or preferences and things like that, that becomes a political problem because we have to pick one thing. Markets don't necessarily require us to pick one thing. We can pick a lot of things. And so a core idea that I think is a liberal idea that we can see different institutions embodying is some idea of kind of permissionless innovation. And markets, I think, are pretty good at this in particular, where this is just, I think, an instantiation of a broader liberal conception of you have some space where you can try stuff without asking other people's permission for it. So we have a bunch of rules for what's not allowed, but then when we don't have a rule against it, you're free to kind of try stuff out and experiment. And markets, I think, make really good use of that. And so both it can be, trying new ideas out and not having to, ask for permission to introduce a new widget or whatever. But it also allows for lots of different kinds of market niches. And this becomes easier the bigger the market is, because it makes more room for more kinds of niches. So one thing that I think is also similar to some liberal institutions, but it's more obvious with market institutions, is that I think markets have no end in both senses of the word end here. So in one sense, it's just markets are procedures that just can carry on forever. There's no real sense of them being done. There's no clear maximum that a market can grow. In my lifetime, which is hopefully relatively short, so far anyway, is US GDP per capita has doubled in the past 40 years. Real global world product per capita has increased by 70%. And probably by the time I retire, will look right now as if right now is quite poor compared to what it'll be like when I retire. And so in that sense, there's no real reason to think that there's a stopping point, because it's not about just kind of more money in your pocket, but it's more stuff you can do. There's more different kinds of ways your preferences can be satisfied. There's new wants and desires that can come online as markets figure out more stuff. And the kind of other kind of related idea here is markets don't have any particular goals beyond what we give them. Other than the procedural idea, markets kind of trying to find valued uses for things. And we're supplying the values there. But generally this means, well, markets, what they're really good at procedurally is driving down the costs of stuff that we want, or figure out ways of avoiding expensive stuff to get more satisfaction of other kinds of preferences. And then the other thing that I think is sometimes underappreciated is that markets come up with new stuff to want because they invent new possibilities that make us better off in the sense of enable more kinds of life for us. So we're getting more of what we have reason to value, even if we didn't know that we would have valued it before the market provided it. So if we want to kind of pull back and ask the question, are markets progressive? I think in one sense, clearly yes, and in one sense, obviously not. So the sense in which markets are progressive, I think, is that they're amazing problem solvers. So just to cherry pick a few sort of examples of something like this. Since 1976, the cost of installed solar power has gone down 99.6%. And the price of provisioning solar power drops about 20% every time we double the installed capacity of solar. So like the learning rate is kind of remarkable. The cost of sequencing human genomes have gone from around $20 million when we first figured out how to do it in 2000. It's about $400 to sequence a full human's genome now. It'll probably be in the realm of a handful of dollars in not too many years. Likewise, lithium-ion batteries used to be about $7,500 per kilowatt hour 30 years ago. Now it's under $200. That is probably going to keep going down until we get a different kind of battery. If we look at something like Moore's law with CPUs, the Intel 4004 processor, which is one of the first like mass-produced at-scale processors, had a little over 2,000 transistors in it. The kind of latest and greatest processor for a general-purpose computer has 57 billion transistors in it. That's kind of amazing. Another, I think, fun one is putting a kilogram into low Earth orbit space. When we first were kind of regularly doing it around 1981, it was about $85,000 to put a kilogram into space. Now it's under $1,000. It's totally plausible to get down to about $100. That's kind of amazing. That creates entirely new possibilities for us that were just unimaginable before. So in all that sense, markets are progressive. They help us achieve some goal more efficiently through time. In another sense, markets aren't progressive because there's no direction until we kind of like institutionally provide them with one via, injecting some signal into the price system. So our political institutions can do something to shape this, but markets by themselves have no particular kind of progress in the way that like an ecosystem has no notion of progress. It just it's responding to itself, but that's about it. And so it kind of depends how we want to think about markets. But I think the reason to be kind of excited about thinking about how to use them for ourselves is this dynamism, diversity, and discovery kind of idea that markets are really good at improving liberal churn in a way that allows us to productively cooperate with each other. So I think I'll stop there and turn things over. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Okay, Julie, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And I think there might be a lot of connections here with what I was going to say with some points that Ryan made. But first, just thanks to Eric and to Piers and to Kate and Emma for hosting and organizing this event, and really appreciate the flexibility of everyone in doing it virtually, and to the people who are taking time to come to another Zoom event here in the audience. Just looking forward to our discussion. So, and I'm going to speak without slides, and I might be a bit more long-winded. So markets can obviously be really powerful engines of economic growth, increasing production, consumption, and income. And so this is readily apparent when you see those plots of long-run GDP growth with that kind of hockey stick shape, and it's really clearly apparent. But if a market is generating economic growth, is it then as readily apparent that we can say that it's producing genuine progress and prosperity, or genuinely making people's lives better in some meaningful sense? So when considering this question, it's important to remember that there's of course no singular or natural form that markets take. So there's a limit to how much we can talk, about markets in general, because markets are of course social institutions, and the form that they take depends on people's legal entitlements, society's property system, regulations, norms, all of the rest, and so forth. So when we're asking whether a market that is generating economic growth is also generating genuine progress, we have to think about particular market arrangements or societies, and we have to think about the relevant comparisons as alternative market arrangements, from those that are more liberalized and extensive to those that are more regulated and constrained, rather than just a comparison to some imagined no markets counterfactual. So bearing that in mind, then, the question that I'm particularly interested in pursuing here is, if a market arrangement is generating economic growth, does it then follow that it's generating genuine progress or meaningfully making people's lives better? So perhaps relative to alternative arrangements, it's making people better off in some respects. So we might have more comfortable homes and longer life expectancy, more opportunities to travel, more consumer choices, and so forth. But at the same time, it might be making people worse off in other respects. So people might have less time relaxing with family and friends. They might have less satisfying work. They might have more anxiety. There might be more pollution and congestion and less beauty. So how then would we assess whether a society that's experiencing economic growth with rising levels of income and wealth is also experiencing meaningful progress and prosperity? Or to put this in more evaluative terms, should policymakers be aiming to maximize economic growth, or should they be aiming, in the way that we structure our market arrangements, to do something else? So a really compelling and appealing answer, and an answer that has wide support, is that policymakers are right to focus on pursuing economic growth, by which I mean, of course, rising GDP per capita, following the Standard Convention, and which for ease I'll refer to more frequently just as rising income and wealth. So on this compelling view, it isn't necessary at the collective political level to engage the question of whether economic growth translates into meaningful progress. Because though money is of course not intrinsically valuable, it is still a fungible, divisible resource that people can use to pursue their own ends, to obtain whatever it is that they value. And if people can use money to obtain what it is that they value, then if they have more money, they can have more of what they value. So the appeal and really the elegance of this approach is that it avoids engaging at the collective political level the question of what genuine progress or meaningful gains are. And so these questions can then just be engaged by individuals in their own lives as they use their incomes to pursue their own preferences. And then the collective answer is just whatever results. So on this approach, it's unproblematic, and indeed it's appropriate for policymakers to focus on arranging market institutions to generate the greatest possible economic growth. Now, of course, This position generally doesn't hold that we should pursue maximal economic growth at any cost, because this tends to have some unpalatable implications, such as that there wouldn't be any protections against unsafe working conditions or against environmental destruction. So a more compelling modified version of the view is that there are some constraints to maintain decent conditions and to maintain environmental sustainability. But then within those constraints, we should be aiming to maximize economic growth. So on this appealing view, the essential questions are just, one, how to generate the greatest amount of income and wealth, and two, how to ensure that people have fair access, to a fair share of this income and wealth. So to put this in more familiar terms, the key questions are just how to grow the pie and how to divide the pie. And so I do think that this view has considerable appeal, and that it's valuable to be limiting the scope for policymakers to be in the business of determining and promoting particular ideas of the good life. But ultimately, I think that the weaknesses with focusing on income and wealth, with focusing just on growing the pie, go deeper than just the challenges of assuring that we maintain some decent conditions and environmental sustainability. And it's also just worth noting here that I'm not going to be engaging also with the problems with ensuring that we're actually fairly dividing the pie, which we plainly are not. And so this was a topic of the first panel in this series, I believe. So I'm not going to go into those questions here. And I think it's also important that we focus not just on the question of how goods are distributed, but what the goods actually are. But just to note that that's an important, really important other issue here. So with that noted then, to put the focus here again in familiar terms, and this might be straining the metaphor, so apologies if it is. I think that though how to grow the pie and how to divide the pie are important questions, I think we also need to ask like what's in the pie, or whether the pie is actually providing what it is thought to provide. And when we take up that question, I think the deeper problem with the idea that rising levels of income and wealth necessarily track meaningful progress and prosperity is a problem with this underlying assumption that people can use money to obtain what they value. So if they have more money, they can have more of what they value. So to see why this assumption doesn't hold, and so why the appealing view ultimately has to be rejected, consider 2 points. And just to note, since I can't put footnotes into remarks, I'm drawing here on some of my own work on free time and on economic growth, but also in particular on work by Martha Nussbaum, Elizabeth Anderson, Jonathan Wolfe, and Avner Dashalit, Sam Arnold, Juliet Shore, Deborah Staggs, among others, but they're really influencing these ideas here. So first, consider why it is that money is valuable to people on this view. So it's because it enables them to pursue their preferences, their values, and their ends. Money is valuable because it is an all-purpose means or resource for people to do whatever it is that they might want to do. So one way that we can express this idea is by saying that money expands people's effective freedom. So you might be free to travel, but if you don't have the money to actually buy a ticket, that freedom to travel isn't really valuable to you. So money is valuable because it gives you effective freedom. It can, in some sense, makes you more free. And so this idea can be expressed in different ways, as real freedom, as capabilities, as genuine opportunities. So that's all well and good. Money does have that role, but having effective freedom does not, of course, only require having money. It depends on a much wider array of resources and social conditions. So to have effective freedom also requires having free time, having the social bases of health, having social relational resources, having physical space and environmental resources, educational and cultural resources, and so forth. So to put that in more general terms, people depend on pursuing their ends on a cluster of resources that are external or material resources, internal or personal resources, social resources and conditions. And each of these different resources and conditions that people depend on has kind of multiple parts and is interlocking. We depend on this really complex web of resources and conditions in order to actually pursue our ends. So money is indeed then a resource that people generally require, but even the effective use of this resource also depends on a set of internal resources. So the knowledge and skills to actually be able to make use of your income, and a set of social conditions. So you have to have functioning markets, available goods and services, social standing, and the means to access the market. And so it depends, even that simple resource depends on this kind of more complex web. And so this point about how we require a broader set of resources could be made with a lot of different examples, but just to draw on some of my own work on free time to illustrate the point. To use again the travel example, if you have this freedom to travel, you of course need the money to buy the ticket, but you also obviously need the free time to actually be able to go on the trip. And more generally, to make effective use of your free time, people also need to have access to shared free time so that they can spend it with other people, as well as free time that is in periods of sufficient duration and on predictable schedules, and on an array of other internal and social conditions so that one can actually make use of that time. So since people's effective freedom, their ability to actually pursue what it is they value, depends on this complex bundle of resources and conditions, and given the pluralism of people's different ideas of the good life, we can't just assume that bundles that are better in terms of income and wealth would advance people's effective freedom more than bundles that are better in terms of these other resources and conditions. And so depending on circumstances for people more generally, or for some groups of people, improvements in the other resources and social conditions might actually better realize or expand their effective freedom more than increasing their shares of income and wealth. And so there's another flaw with the income-focused approach, which is that we might think that one way of kind of avoiding these problems is by recognizing or assuming that, well, an income-focused approach still works because money is a fungible resource and we can use it to purchase the other resources and conditions on which effective freedom depends. So on this line, we could grant that there are all these other resources and social conditions people require to pursue their ends, but conveniently money is this fungible resource that we can use to purchase all of the other resources and social conditions. But unfortunately, we can't make that assumption because money isn't perfectly fungible with all the other resources and social conditions. And we can't necessarily use money to purchase these other valuable inputs into our ability to pursue our ends. And this is for a number of reasons, but most obviously, the market scope doesn't extend to all domains. So some things that are generally required just can't be purchased, like social relational resources. And there might also be some domain-specific reasons why a market, though technically feasible, shouldn't be extended into a particular domain, like, say, the organ market, which I take it as topic of one of the future events in this series. Another reason why we can't take this fungibility assumption is that some of the generally required means depend on collective action and public investment, and increasing shares of people's personal income may crowd out these public goods, or at least doesn't necessarily lead to their provision. And then there, of course, are some resources and conditions that are, while they might be to some extent exchangeable on a market, the market's offerings are importantly incomplete, or they're exchangeable only at really significant cost. And then, of course, having money doesn't always provide the means to address social inequality and marginalization. So for all those reasons, we can't then assume that we can simply use money to obtain the other resources and conditions that people require to be able to pursue their ends. To use the free time example again, so one can't always forego income for more leisure, which the kind of textbook model would hold, because work in one's field is often only available at set hours and part-time work is undersupplied. And as a result, many people are overemployed. They prefer to work fewer hours, even for a corresponding reduction in pay, but they can't do so. And further, one can't always increase one's free time by spending more money. So you can't pay someone to sleep or exercise for you. And in some domains, there might be some ethical concerns, even if it were possible, in some instances with respect to caregiving. And moreover, the social conditions to make use of one's free time depend on collective resources. So a shared, safe, inclusive spaces, recreational spaces, social opportunities, and they depend on the collective coordination to ensure shared free time. And then of course, those who are time poor might be marginalized and excluded from civic and social opportunities. And just increasing people's income and wealth isn't going to address all of these problems with another important resource people require. So as such, first, because our effective freedom depends on a wider array of resources and conditions than money, and because improvements on these other dimensions may better ensure effective freedom. And second, because money is not perfectly fungible with these other resources and conditions, we can't just assume that if a market system is increasing income and wealth and fairly distributing it, that it's delivering genuine progress and prosperity. So we can't then rely on the appealingly simple view that policymakers, within some constraints, just need to focus on expanding and fairly distributing the income and wealth pie. So what then should we be doing if we can't take the appealingly simple view? So, and this is just very briefly, and hopefully we can talk about this more in the discussion. I think that we need to think about prosperity in explicitly multidimensional terms, reflecting the full bundle of resources and social conditions that people require to pursue their ends. And second, we must then assess particular market arrangements and broader societal arrangements by how well they secure and expand this multidimensional understanding of prosperity. So to take another go with the metaphors here, I think we need to move from an image of growing the pie to an image of expanding what's on the table. I'm still kind of playing around with trying to figure out better metaphor. Suggestions welcome. And so though the income and wealth focused approach still enjoys widespread support and a policy focus on GDP is still predominant, it's been this really especially valuable development in recent years that there's been a lot of work challenging the reliance on GDP as the measure of societal well-being and advocating alternative metrics. And there have been a great number of alternative indicators that have been developed and advanced. I just want to draw attention to one set, which is broadly follows the capabilities approach developed by Nussbaum and Sen, which can be thought of as probing beneath why it is that we care about income and wealth, and namely that they are the means to pursue things we value, and instead focus directly on people's capabilities to achieve valued ways of doing and being, to use Nussbaum's words. And I think that this is broadly the right approach, that we should be understanding and pursuing progress and prosperity in terms of people's multidimensional capabilities. That said, I think that there are still some challenging questions about how to develop and implement this alternative approach, in particular, how to do so without imposing a particular idea of the good life, and how to pursue gains fairly across the multiple dimensions. I do think that these challenges can be met, but there's some of the questions I'm pursuing now in my current work. So just to put this all together in closing, when we're asking whether a society that is experiencing economic growth with rising levels of income and wealth is also by implication experiencing meaningful progress and prosperity, I think that the appealing answer that we can just focus on income and wealth, safe in the assumption that with more money, people can obtain more of what they value. I don't think that we can accept that view. And instead, we just have to think about prosperity explicitly in multidimensional terms. And we have to assess particular arrangements by how well they would secure and expand this multidimensional understanding. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to move now to discussion between the panelists. I'll start by inviting them to answer some questions and engage with some of each other's points. But again, the Q&A is open, and I encourage all of you to pose your questions there. Something we try to do in these sessions is identify and draw out areas of disagreement between our panelists. So while I heard a lot of overlap in your remarks, I'm going to try and pull out some places where I thought there was a potential for disagreement. So I want to start with a really basic question. I hope not too basic. What is a market? So you both touched on this a little bit in your remarks. They're social institutions, maybe liberal social institutions. They're mechanisms that collect information and create incentives. But I heard Julie talking more about money than Ryan did. And so I wondered to what extent we're working with a definition of markets that is limited to the price function, or whether there's a sort of broader conception of what can count as a market. So the first thing, and either of you can start here, is when you're answering the question of are markets progressive or do markets contribute to innovation, what's the sense of market that you have in mind?
I can jump in. So yeah, I think my sense is Julie and I are pretty much on the same page with what we're thinking of as a market. So, you know, a system of trade with some scope for rules that govern, you know, what can be traded and what the rules are and that sort of stuff. I do think, you know, a focus on money is a differentiator between Julie and I, at least a little bit here. But I don't think that's because we're understanding markets particularly differently from each other. So yeah, you can have, you know, small scale markets or really big ones. You know, the extent of the market is an important factor in what's going on with them. But in that, Julie, do you disagree about?
You know, I think that's right, Ryan. I don't think we disagree. And I also would say that I think it's important for us to think about markets in a really capacious sense, or at least for my purposes. And they can take a really wide range of forms, and depending especially on how much they're constrained and who has the power within the market, they can look really radically different and can be used for very different ends. And so the kind of work I'm doing, especially now, part of this focus on money or on income, is in our focus on economic growth as like the outcome of interest. And so the issues I have are not with markets, but rather with what it is that we are arranging them to try to achieve. So that's one way of putting that.
Great, that's helpful, thank you. So I think there's kind of two relationships we're talking about, or a way of breaking down the overall relationship we're talking about. On the one hand, some kind of connection between markets and innovation. And then on the other hand, some kind of relationship between innovation and progress. And I thought Ryan talking a little more about that first relationship between markets and innovation, and Julie talking a bit more about the second, of under what conditions does innovation count as progress or genuine progress. So I think it'll make sense to spend a little bit of time talking about where, if at all, you disagree there. Maybe a good starting point is to ask Ryan whether you endorse what Julie called the appealing answer, that we should just be focusing on growth, or that we can afford to sort of focus on letting markets do their work.
So yeah, I think there's something really interesting about where Julie and I agree and disagree. So I totally agree with Julie that there are all these, like a very highly dimensional bundle of goods that we have reasons to care about, for, you know, and what we all value is requires a whole bunch of different things, and those bundles kind of as wholes are going to be the determinants of our well-being, however you want to think about our well-being. Where I suspect we might have some disagreements is whether we can or ought to have some kind of social choice over which are the favored bundles. And so this is one of the reasons why I was avoiding some progress language, where I think a real virtue of markets is that it allows for us to disagree about what kinds of lives we find valuable, what kinds of market or non-market goods we think are important, and how we want to arrange ourselves within various liberal institutions. I think making room for a lot of disagreement is extraordinarily valuable. Another thing that I'm not clear on how much Julie and I differ, I think, is I think GDP estimates, reducing things down to just to income is tricky for a bunch of reasons, but almost all those alternative measures that I've come across correlate really well with GDP, except for like a couple weird outliers. In general, GDP is a pretty decent proxy. But I want to note that the thing that I think is important about when we conceive of like getting wealthier isn't, you know, how many dollars are in some bank account, but as Julie was saying, you know, like our effective freedoms are increased. And one of the things that markets do is increase the scope of things that we could possibly do, not just, you know, can I now afford this object? So, you know, we're on Zoom right now. We're having we're doing this instead of meeting in person for, you know, public health kinds of reasons. 10 years ago, this would have been using an incredibly clunky piece of software that wouldn't work very well. When I was born, this was just not possible at all. There are a whole bunch of like new horizons that have opened up because of this market stuff that's not really captured by, you know, slight adjustments of relative price. There's a whole bunch of stuff that had an infinite relative price before that are now, you know, effectively free. And that's the innovation and dynamism side of markets, I think, is really important. And so when we look at like those other social determinant kinds of things that Julie was talking about, which I agree are important, all of those are subject to our economic and technological mix, which are caught up in the dynamism of markets. And so I don't want people to come away thinking that like markets are the only thing that are valuable, but they're really useful for a bunch of the stuff that we care about. And they leave room for way more value disagreement than some other institutional ways of kind of aggregating people's wants and interests. So I'll stop there, and maybe Julie wants to respond.
Yeah, great, thanks. Oh, so I think it's helpful, as you put it, Emma, to think about the connection between markets and innovation, and then between innovation and progress. And so I, you know, think that there's, you know, I wouldn't be fully on board with a lot of what Ryan is saying about the connection between markets and innovation, and the value of dynamism and diversity in the ways that markets can promote them. I mean, even on that point, I think though we might, you know, it's important to think about how markets are structured and who has power within them, and how that influences what kind of innovation we have. And so I think especially, this is especially clear if we think about automation in the workplace. And so if the people who are deciding what kind of automation to implement and then to currently, you know, refine through the ongoing kind of experimentation in the everyday workplace, you know, you're going to get very different results if the people who are deciding about what kind of automation are the managers, or if they are the workers. And so those kinds of examples can shape what sort of innovation we get. And so I think we do need to be attentive to that. But my concerns tend to be more with the, you know, from this kind of market innovation link to the, you know, progress, which is also a word I try to avoid. It was a very loaded word. Development in some way. I think that it's important to once we recognize that our ability to pursue our ends depends on this really multidimensional bundle of resources and conditions, that I don't think we can abdicate our role for political institutions to play a role in shaping what it is that we have available to us, because if we just leave it to the market, we'll get a particular outcome. It won't just be, we can't just assume that it's going to reflect everyone's aggregate preferences in the way that we sometimes do and assume. So I think that the example of how free time is undersupplied is a good one there, where because there are these limitations of markets, there are these kind of market failures, we have to have a role for political institutions in ensuring that people have access to this really vital resource to pursue their ends. And that resource is really undersupplied simply through the market. And I think that the same thing then applies in lots of other cases. The environment is a really obvious one. But if we think about other kinds of social spaces and conditions, we could see the same dynamics, I think. And so once we recognize that, then it's unavoidable that we collectively need to play some role. And then I think that it is difficult to ensure that we're doing that fairly in a way that's consistent with like broad pluralist values. I think that we can do that, but I don't think that we can avoid having to do that.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, Julie, in your initial remarks, and then again in that answer, you sort of pointed to the desirability of not imposing a particular idea of the good life. I take it that's a kind of liberal commitment that you share, but do you think there are any degrees of difference in how you're approaching that question? For instance, Julie, is part of your concern that markets constrain our access to some conceptions of a good life, or at least that the effects of markets do? Or perhaps you see ways of avoiding objectionably imposing a conception of the good life without using the market mechanism as extensively as we might. Like, are there other institutions that can avoid doing that?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question. It's something I've been working through, and I'm not sure exactly where my views are going to end up on this. But I think we need to have some, I think one way of avoiding the idea that we're imposing particular ideas of the good life is by thinking about in a more kind of first principle sort of way, well, what is it that people need to have access to in order to pursue their ends, whatever their ends might be? And so the pluralism comes in and embracing the whatever their ends might be, and kind of starting at this earlier step of, what kinds of resources would people require to pursue them, in the same way that we can think about what kind of liberal freedoms should people have in a way that is also not imposing ideas of the good life, but kind of setting conditions for people to achieve their ends. So I think we can think about the social resources, the economic resources in the same way. And so then it's just a matter of trying to figure out what is it that we would want to be ensuring that people have access to in order to do those diverse ends, and that we could articulate an answer to that in a way that doesn't impose particular ideas of the good life. And then I just think the next step is to argue that we can't just assume that the market is going to produce whatever it is that we had realized was valuable in that way, because it will undersupply some things and oversupply other things. And so then there's this role for broadly democratic decision-making to shape what it is that we're providing. And just also that markets are, because of the way they are unavoidably social institutions, whatever we do is going to be shaping whatever market outcomes we get. And so we just need to pay attention to what we're doing and what we get out of it, basically.
Ryan, do you have anything to add there on whether there are any kinds of political institutions that can compete with markets as ways of sort of responding to people's desires and interests without objectionably imposing a conception of the good life?
Well, so I take it both Julie and I are in general fans of liberal institutions writ large, and markets are one liberal institution. Our political system is another. Then we have all kinds of civic institutions that help contribute to how we interact with each other and what on what kind of dimensions we engage in social cooperation with each other and pursue our own ends. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that I think all we need is markets or something like that. That's obviously false. And I agree with Julie that there's not really any kind of like natural market that pre-exists other human institutions. All of these are things that we made up for ourselves, and we have reason to take advantage of them for the kind of good properties that they have, and be aware of the properties that might be problematic. So Julie's, I think, rightly pointing to where power disparities can generate certain market outcomes that more equal power wouldn't generate. But that's also true for political institutions and social institutions and church institutions and whatever else you want to look at. We're going to find various kinds of failures from ideals that we might want to imagine. And some of those are going to be more predictable than others. Where I think there might be a bit more daylight between Julie and I in thinking about some of this stuff is I'm really skeptical that we're smart enough to figure out exactly the list of things that we need to live a full range of kinds of lives that we don't know exist yet. And so when I'm laying bets, it's on I'm going to be wrong about predicting the future, and I want to make sure that insofar as we're picking rules for ourselves, we're better off not picking rules to get to some particular end that we think is currently desirable, but rather we want rules for ourselves that allow for us to keep adapting as we learn more and as the world changes around us. A desirable feature of markets in general is that they're really adaptive and they're really good at absorbing disparate bits of information. I agree with Julie that you have to, make sure that the markets can see the information that we want them to care about. Like if you don't price pollution in, you're going to get market outcomes that are really polluting. But you can price pollution in. That's a political choice that we could make to shape the nature of markets, and so on and so forth. We can have different forms of corporate governance that allow for greater worker power versus greater capital power or whatever. There's lots of different possibilities here. In Germany, co-determination of firms is quite common. It's not as if they are not a GDP-driven market economy that has an interest in growth and innovation. There's lots of room for kind of various institutional experimentation, and I think that's part of market dynamism, allowing for more of that. And so it might be that to foster more market dynamism, you have to constrain the unfettered run of some markets to make sure that you're leaving space for the experimentation and things like that.
Okay, that's a nice segue into some of the first questions that have appeared in the chat, which I will start giving to you now. So the first couple address just this, the sort of transformative nature of markets and the question about what kinds of ends we have reasons to value. So Morgan asks, to Julie in particular, maybe a way to extend the pie metaphor is to ask not just how big the pie is or how to cut it, but how nutritious it is. Your argument is thus to put a more balanced diet on the table. I anticipate that Ryan might disagree with this a little bit, or at least with the idea that we can identify what's nutritious or good for us in advance before letting the market mechanism run. But Julie, what do you think of that? Is nutrition or a conception of what kind of progress would be good for us the right way to think about this?
Yeah, no, great. And that kind of connects to something Ryan was just saying, which I quite take the point of about how I think is really important to be bearing in mind that a great degree of humility about how smart we are in figuring out what it is that people need and imposing that in some kind of top-down way. I think it would be important in the implementation of an alternative approach, and I think this alternative approach is very broadly consistent with a lot of work that's being done in developing these multidimensional alternative indicators, that it would have to be done in a kind of dynamic, iterative way. And so we would, if you had very broad categories of what it is that people need, like broadly a certain kind of social resources or broadly educational opportunities, that we would still have a lot of innovation and dynamism in determining, what exactly is going into that and how would it change over time and evolve over time. And so that we wouldn't have a very rigid understanding of that. But I do think that we could have big buckets that we could identify, even if we aren't specifying them in detail. So then to the question about trying to come up, I appreciate very much someone joining me and trying to come up with other metaphors here. I had been thinking about that one about changing it to, swap out the pie for a balanced meal. But then that sounded a bit too potentially scolding, where this, particular idea of health or nutrition. And so, it might be better to use I'm not sure, but something that is suggestive of really expanding the scope of conditions that allow people to pursue different ideas of the good life is really the key here. And so it isn't that, there's some ideal way of living that requires like this particular kind of balance in one's life. That's not the idea, but rather that, in fact, like the kind of, the Ryan's embrace of the weird and the different, ensuring that people actually have space for the conditions to explore all of the weird and the different. And the concern would be that we don't actually always provide that because we're often providing only a relatively narrow set of resources to people.
Great. I'm going to build on that. And Ryan, if there's anything you'd like to respond to there, feel free in this next question. So my colleague, Dana Howard, works on transformative experiences, and she has a question about how this plays into thinking about markets. So markets create new things. Ryan, I think you put this in terms of it gives us more stuff we have reason to value. And Dana suggests, well, I might not have those reasons yet. If the stuff doesn't exist, I'm not yet the person who values that future stuff. And so why think we should value this feature of the market prior to each of these transformative developments happening if we don't yet value these things? Why is it good for us to create new stuff to become attached to and value, especially if creating the new stuff may further deplete natural resources or have other costs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are a couple of ways of thinking about it. So one is you can engage in a little bit of backwards induction. You can look at any previous point in the past and think about whether there are things that we value. It doesn't have to be stuff. It can be the ways that we can socially relate with each other, or some civic values that are better realized thanks to some market innovations or whatever. And say, hey, should we have rewound the clock to some previous age or some previous instantiation in the market? In general, I think people are going to say no to that. But another part of it is, I think something that is not quite as appreciated as it maybe ought to be is, in general, we're getting way, way, way better at increasing economic growth, say, by using less and less stuff. So dematerialized growth has been accelerating over the past 25, 30 years, where like the next unit of prosperity uses a lot less stuff, and that it's totally plausible that we'll get significantly better at this. So the most productive sector of the American economy by like a couple orders of magnitude is software, which overwhelmingly is dematerialized. It's converting all the stuff that used to be atoms into bits, and making our lives significantly wealthier without using more stuff, which is kind of amazing and something that we have reason to hope more happens with. But on the kind of forward-looking aspect of sort of why should we want new things to value? So some of this is just, I think this is the excitement of liberalism, full stop. Like we're not, there's no reason to think that we're done. There's no reason to think that we've got even a particularly good set of values yet. We need to keep figuring more stuff out. And to me, that's just the exciting element of liberalism that I think is sometimes lost in the literature when people think about kind of like equilibrium states and whether, this is a desirable end or not, or how do we achieve this particular end. I think the fun stuff is what's yet to come, kind of figuring out better versions of ourselves and more exciting possibilities and new ways of being. That stuff I think is just intrinsically valuable, the search for it, and it's instrumentally valuable. It has generated lots of good outcomes for us, but I think it's kind of caught up in what it is to exercise your autonomy at a really basic level, is to discover these new possibilities and ways of valuing.
Just quickly to jump in here, I just was thinking of a point of connection with some of what Ryan was saying, which is also that a lot of the critiques of economic growth, you can see in them an idea that we can reach some state where we have enough, or we've reached some state of perfection and then we just need to kind of stay there. And I share this idea that, you know, we should avoid thinking about things like that, and that instead we should be thinking about gains in this much more open-ended way. And so kind of embrace also that idea that, though I don't think we should be focusing on economic growth, I do think that we shouldn't throw out the idea of pursuing this kind of open-ended expansion. It's just a matter of figuring out on what dimensions we should be trying to expand.
Okay. So my colleague Ben McKean has a question for Ryan that I think actually picks up on another potential area of difference in emphasis between you. So he says to Ryan, in your description of the benefit of markets, you implicitly center the experience of being a consumer, choosing among bundles of goods. The flip side of that experience is that most of us also have to sell our labor power on the market, where we often face employers with vastly more power than us to set the terms of exchange. And Julie, you talked about this a little bit, sort of my inability to choose the package of salary and hours I might prefer, given the limitations of the options that are available to me. So Ben asks, do you think the dynamics of labor markets are importantly different or require different kinds of regulation than other markets in order to be progressive?
So again, I think that's a great question. I want to just on the word progressive, the way I want to use that is something like things that we have reason to value now, we think we can get more of, or something like that, rather than a stronger, thicker conception. Because I'm really wary of using a thicker conception there. But so yeah, you can say you know, look at the U.S. There's reason to think that, you know, there are a variety of instances of overwhelming power of employers, to the point where you have kind of they're monopsony purchasers of labor, and so they have far more power on the market, and you as a laborer don't have nearly enough, and that structures relations poorly. And you know, we could, you know, get into Elizabeth Anderson's lovely book, you know, Private Government, and think about, you know, what happens within a firm or something like this. So I think some of this is the answer is you need a better market. So an exciting feature of technologies like Zoom and things like that, and everyone's experience of working from, or lots of people's experience of working from home, is maybe we can decouple your work from where you live in a way that vastly expands your ability as a worker to pick what kind of a firm and that you want to work for, and under what terms, including, you know, your hours and things like that. So that's one kind of thing. But for sure, I mean, it's not as if I'm against, you know, regulating markets reasonably to, you know, make sure that workers can't, workers aren't in unsafe working conditions, or for some reason labor markets are structured in such a way that there's monopsony purchase of labor. That's there's been a lot of interesting work done on that. So I think Posner and Weil have a really interesting paper looking at market failures, where basically monopsony labor purchasing costs workers, you know, a very large portion of their money, and that's a regulatory failure by and large. That's not kind of the natural outcome of markets. That's, you know, our current set of institutions failing us kind of badly. So yeah, I think labor markets are obviously important, but, you know, one way of thinking about you know, how markets can improve is you get more choices. You don't have to care about what region you live in and what your job could be possibly in the future. You can pick your hours. You can more easily be freelance. You can more easily start your own company and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can think about how you sell your labor. And I think a better functioning market is one where those sets of options expand for you. And we can kind of play with different possibilities and see what makes sense for some and maybe not for others.
A great question. And I think, you know, it's important to emphasize this point about how we do need to be evaluating social arrangements, not just from the perspective of ourselves as consumers, but also as producers, as fellow citizens in the broad sense of people who share a society together. On the point about producers, or about the labor market in particular, I think one way of thinking about this is, so Anka Geush and Lisa Herzog have a nice paper called "The Goods of Work Other Than Money," and it sets out some of the things that the valuable things that people can get out of work, and like a sense of excellence, a sense of community, being able to make a contribution, having a kind of social recognition. And these are all valuable things that people can ideally get out of work. And also importantly, I think it's important to recognize that we don't only get these out of work. And so then the idea is to kind of take those values that people could get out of work, and how could we structure our arrangements to ensure that people, again, this gets to the fair distribution question, but to ensure that people in general are having access to this kind of broader multidimensional set of goods that we can get out of work, and ways of then thinking about what types of possible ways of adjusting the labor market would better ensure that people have access to all of these different ideally achievable goods in work.
Julie, or either of you, do you think your solution here involves a greater role for social choice procedures than Ryan's would? I mean, does it involve something like unions playing a role in setting the terms of work, or building in sort of political decision-making, not just correcting the market mechanisms?
Yeah, great, thanks, Emma. Yeah, I think both of those would prove to be important, and ultimately at the large-scale political democratic level, I think would end up being some of the most important. But yes, definitely, I think it, especially when we're thinking about the things that have to do with work, so the conditions of work, but also the kind of innovation that we get out of workplaces can be affected by the powers and like the structures of decision-making within workplaces. So thinking about unions, thinking about workplace democracy, thinking about other ways like co-determination, other kinds of ways of structuring things there, I think that could do a lot. But I wouldn't want to think that necessarily would solve everything, because that only covers a kind of part of the picture, and also people are still operating from within particular perspectives or interests in taking up those roles. And so I do think that there is this need for a broader political thing where we can think about, as Mark Sagoff makes this nice distinction between our consumer preferences and our citizen preferences, and similarly also our worker preferences. So at some point, I do think we need to take up the perspective of the citizen, the broader perspective. And sometimes that might be done at a very local level, sometimes at a broader level, but it does mean having to engage in more explicit discussions about legislation and regulation, about spending, about where we impose various constraints, like for instance with environmental things. And so the idea would be hopefully to have some kind of principles that would help guide that process, so that it isn't just the kind of normal mess of politics. Obviously, how to implement things in a way that avoids the normal mess of politics is not, that's a big problem and not my specialty. So.
Great. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, I think about whether Ryan's giving the market too much credit, or whether too many of the benefits of a system that involves or makes use of markets are being credited to the market itself. So Malta asks, is there a way of determining what part of the reduction in prices of various goods is caused by market mechanisms rather than by government subsidies for research and technology? And to what extent should innovations that result from processes within firms, often hierarchical processes within firms, should we count that as a market innovation? A second attendee asks, how do you sort of factor in the role of government institutions that correct externalities and market failures?
Yeah, so again, I think markets are best understood as one of several liberal institutional arrangements that play a really important role. So markets are good at at kind of one, compared to, say, government-sponsored research or university research and things like that. Markets are really good at turning stuff into products. They're good at turning and making that product cheap and available and all that kind of good stuff. So for sure, private firms take advantage of knowledge generated with public dollars all of the time. That's good. It shouldn't be a either or thing. It should be everyone kind of contributing their part to broader goals of social cooperation. So I think it's kind of hard to tease out exactly how much credit you should give in one thing versus another. But I will say that even if a lot of work was done by, say, colleagues in a university or something like that, if it's even just like the last 10% of turning that into a product that makes that innovation available to other people and shifts their lives positively, that last 10% matters a lot. It's the same as, if you're, two people are trying to move a piano and they can't pick it up, and then one third person comes along and helps them move it. You needed that last person. Otherwise, the piano wasn't going to move. So it's all important. So I'm certainly not like a market fundamentalist. I'm a university professor in philosophy. So chances are I thought there are other things that are valuable also, given my life choices. But for sure, markets are doing a lot of valuable work, even if they're taking on inputs from other sources like government research and things like that. But like, that's what markets are supposed to do. They're supposed to pull in information and put them to productive uses, so that we have other sources that are generating that information. Great. That's exactly how to kind of seed the market to do useful things with it. Especially, this can get at something that Julie was talking about of, if we just let market processes run wild, perhaps they're not factoring in things that we care about, government-sponsored research or foundation-sponsored research or whatever, helps nudge market processes in a certain direction by kind of injecting relevant information or know-how into the system, such that market participants can take advantage of it. And great, that's good. And same with issues around, I live in Buffalo. I definitely am aware of kind of hollowed out manufacturing in the United States and things like this. And so I think that it's hard to pull apart two things. One is, someone making a savings maximizing option right now versus what allows for dynamism over the long run. And it's very hard to figure out in any given moment how best to do that. So some amount of offshoring and things like that, I think, are good. They help people in other countries a whole lot. They free up labor to do other tasks. It used to be that like 0.5% of the entire American economy was in nail production. It's good that that's not the case anymore, because it freed us up to do other stuff that's important. But it is a question of, what role should the government play or other actors play in, say, being a market maker to create a new thing to support people who have lost jobs or try to foster a new sector or something like that. These are really hard questions that I don't think there are clear answers to. But I would say that, when we're thinking about this, the way I would focus our attention is what leaves us with lots of room to operate. So what gives us room for future moves and leaves kind of more dynamism open for more people to exercise their capacities usefully. That's not a easy, quick answer, but I think markets are good at trying to help us figure some of that stuff out.
Good. We're about at our canonical end time, so I'm going to give the last word to Julie and see whether you have any areas of agreement or disagreement there about what the right place of the market is within an overall system of social cooperation that promotes effective freedom or meaningful progress.
I was going to actually leave it there, so I think I might, I will leave it there. I think that there is a place for markets, but we do need to be thinking about to what ends we are structuring them, and to be kind of engaged in this ongoing dynamic process of ensuring that we are ensuring the conditions that actually enable people to pursue the broad range of ends that they might want to pursue. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for your participation today. This was really informative, and you can tell our people in the Q&A agreed. So we appreciate your time. And thanks to all of you for attending and participating. We hope to see you at future COMPAS events. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks very much.